If you have seen recent headlines, then you'll see that DDR5 prices have absolutely skyrocketed, and the biggest reason for this is the base cost of the DDR5 modules themselves on spot exchanges have also skyrocketed in price, meaning a lot of manufacturers of DDR5 memory modules have to pay a lot more money to be able to produce, say, a 16 gigabyte stick of DDR5, even versus a few months ago. However, in recent headlines, we're seeing that GPU prices are set to skyrocket, and they are going to go up at such a high rate that you should just rush out and buy a GPU now. And when I research this, I kind of get very conflicting data that states that I do believe we'll see a gradual increase in GPU prices, and this is mainly due to the fact that we've just seen much higher inflation rates in the last 5 years than we have, especially annualized, versus previous decades beforehand. And we'll talk about the inflation factor with today's video. But one thing that I wanted to point out was in some cases of graphics cards, and when I did a lot more research, for instance, we'll pull up the RTX 3060 12 gigabyte. This is a huge part of the equation versus, believe it or not, the RTX 5070 12 gigabyte. Here you've got two graphics cards with very similar sized die. That's the piece of silicon that's going on the PCB, yet the MSRP price of these graphics cards has gone from, in early 2021, from an MSRP of 329 USD to now an MSRP of 549 USD. Now, of course, I know there is a huge elephant in the room here, and that of course is going from a Samsung 8nm node, which reportedly costs Nvidia about $5,000 per wafer, to TSMC's 4nm, which reportedly costs Nvidia around $15,000 per wafer. So a 200% price increase. This trend was simply because of TSMC breaking away from all silicon competitors, Intel and Samsung included, and being a complete standout, where if you didn't use TSMC, especially for high performance computing like GPU products, you were going to fall behind. However, here's where, with napkin math, we can calculate roughly a 45 USD premium per RTX 5070 die over that of an RTX 3060 die. And this is a very important factor here because we've seen the performance go up roughly on these two models when we compare them. It's around 60 to 70% for a performance increase. But then we've also seen the price go up around 67%, making it so that a 5070 really isn't that much better value, or actually very minimal. It's almost like a side stagnant increase in raw value over the last 4 years, which is very odd if you've been in tech long enough, because I've been this is a tech enthusiast since I was a kid, and I've just seen so much BS being passed in the industry that it makes it hard to believe a lot of these headlines. And every time I look at something now, I'm very skeptical. I'll dig deeper into it. And then of course, I'll make a video if it's worthy of it and if it can help people make better purchasing decisions, especially when it comes to gaming PC tech. And so what I saw with DDR5, for instance, was I saw, okay, this was real. This was a real effect that was happening, regardless of my personal skepticism with DDR5 and the fact that it's happening right before Christmas. And a lot of companies will have, especially massive companies, will have annualized budgets. They'll have monthly budgets, and they won't just suddenly go out and rush out and buy DDR5 when that's not part of the plan. So I am skeptical about the DDR5 sudden, just crazy rush for AI demand. And I do believe there is some funny buggers going on there, but it doesn't change the fact that the prices were going to go up. And I made a video basically telling everyone, look, DDR5 prices were still pretty good on some of these websites, and here's where you could get a good deal. And also go out in the used market, buy some kits up right now, because it's just gonna get a lot worse. And it did get a lot worse. With GPU prices, I don't feel like they're going to get a lot worse, at least not in scale versus the DDR5 price increases. And we'll get back to this example. And so today's video is just gonna be throwing a heap of different information out there and then coming to a conclusion where I feel like actually some models of graphics cards will stay very similar in pricing, and then other models of graphics cards from, say, AMD will go up in price by the actual said rumored prices of roughly 10%. But let's get back now to this RTX 5070 12 gigabyte versus RTX 3060 12 gigabyte scenario, because It's just such an interesting comparison where, as we pointed out before, the die sizes are very similar and also the VRAM sizes are identical. But then also, when we look at the inflation that has happened in that time frame, there is different ways of measuring inflation, but ultimately, it's going to point towards the fact that Nvidia is actually making more money on an RTX 5070 than they were on an RTX 3060 12GB. In other words, they're making more profit. They're making higher margins on this particular model of graphics card than they did on a previous graphics card. And forget the naming scheme here because it appears on paper to be a very similar spec. And all these companies in tech, they can just tell you all the marketing jargon that they want, but at the end of the day, a dozen eggs is always going to be a dozen eggs. And I'm sure there's going to be that one guy out there that's going to be like, nah, actually, dude, 2 dozen is a dozen nowadays. Get with the times. However, continuing on with the higher margins on the RTX 5070 than say versus a 3060 12GB, is that even if we give this GPU, the 5070, a much more generous and what I feel is a much more realistic inflationary figure, which I've calculated to be roughly, believe it or not, 8.5 to 10%, 10% being on the higher side of what we've actually seen with annualized inflation over the last 5 years. Versus say the previous decade and the decade before that, when we look at annualized figures on everyday items that people just need, whether it's chicken or eggs or ground beef or even electricity. When we look at these things, we're getting inflation figures that are annualized around 8.5% to 10%. And then when we compare that to the government's CPI, that's the inflation figures that they have with a bundle of goods that they tell everyone this is the real inflation figures, we see that that's 4.7%. So massive discrepancy from the inflation figures we're getting from government versus a lot of items that we need in our everyday life. And a lot of those items, you can't substitute them because, say for instance, a kilo of ground-fed grass beef is always going to be a kilo of ground-fed grass beef. You can't say, hey, look, this packet of Doritos has actually stayed the same price, yet the packet of Doritos has went from 200 grams to 150 grams. That shrinkflation doesn't come into the equation when we're looking at these staple items here that remain the same weight and remain the same quality. And now you're like, Brian, what's this got to do with the graphics card? Well, the reason this has got to do with the graphics card prices here is even when we go with our worst figure here of 10% annualized inflation, it makes it so that an RTX 3060 12GB of $329 of MSRP would, even with this aggressive inflation figure, be around 480 USD. Then we tack on a $45 TSMC Silicon Premium, and this is the point I'm trying to drive home here for the Nvidia side of the equation. We are still under the 549 USD MSRP. In other words, Nvidia, even with the huge leniencies for cost calculations, is still making more money per unit sold on an RTX 5070 than they were on, say, an RTX 3060 12GB, which means that they've got room to move, which also means that they can absorb some of these higher increases in costs of PCBs, as well as VRMs and even GDDR7, which, a funny interlude here, GDDR7 is actually gone up less in price than GDDR6 has over a similar time period, which is important here because what I'm going to say is basically an RTX 5070 on Black Friday sales coming under 549, even though it's a decent deal comparatively to all the other cards out there and the performance you're getting, I still feel like it's not going to get jacked up in price. You're not going to see an RTX 5070 anytime soon go well over $600 and just remain there for the time being. I feel like these cards could either stay the same price for the next few months or even come down because there are negative factors involved here. For instance, PC companies like CyberPower PC have recently just said, look, we're going to be jacking up our prices from December 7th. And we've seen that DDR5 prices are definitely going to be deterring a lot of people from building a new PC. So when all these prices go up on other components, it can deter people and drop the demand down from buying other components like a graphics card. So there's that counterbalance effect there, which is why I feel some of these graphics cards, especially the ones with higher margins for Nvidia, will either stay the same price or possibly even come down. And if you've watched this far, you may be raising your eyebrow going, okay, so that's a lot different to what I've been hearing from all these other places. And they're telling us just go out and buy a graphics card right now, prices are just going to go up. And here's where I did say earlier in the video that I do believe it pertains to certain models. And here's where we're going to continue on with our research and why I think if you've been looking at, say, an RX 9070 XT or a 9070, you may wish to go out and get one now rather than later. And the reason for this is we look at the recent article. There was an article I read on Tech Power Up where they were talking about internal rumors where AMD is going to be raising the prices of their graphics cards, citing higher costs by about 10%. And this will be coming into effect in the next batches of GPUs. And here's where I think this has definitely a lot of weight to it, because when I look at the margins, and I can give you guys a pretty good example here where I do my research on, say, an RX 6700 XT. This has a very similar die size to that of the RX 9070 XT. And when that came out in 2021, roughly 4 years before the RX 9070 XT, that was $479 US. Now, today we've got the RX 9070 XT at $599. And it's also got more VRAM, 16 gigabytes of VRAM versus the 12 gigabytes on the RX 6700 XT. And so if we look at those 4 years and we calculate our worst case scenario of annualized inflation, just like we did for the RTX 5070 over the 3060 12 gigabyte, and we look at that, which then means that AMD's margins for an RX 9070 XT theoretically are lower than that of what they made on an RX 6700 XT. And just like the Nvidia comparison, AMD is paying more per unit of silicon sold on an RX 9070 XT than they were on an RX 6700 XT. And here's where I've calculated this at roughly a $37.50 premium. It's not as big as the Nvidia comparison, as AMD previously used TSMC for the RX 6000 Series 2, and although it was cheaper per wafer than the 4N used in the RX 9070 XT, it still has had a substantial price increase per wafer in recent years. Now looking at this $739 calculation, you might be like, this is ridiculous. AMD and its board partners just simply cannot sell an RX 9070 XT at this price. It won't sell. And you'd probably be right, especially if we look at the current street pricing. However, the point I'm trying to drive home here is that if we are calculating price increases on the Nvidia cards of similar die sizes, the same way we are to the AMD cards, it makes it so that one is coming under MSRP, that's the Nvidia card, RTX 5070, and the other is coming well over MSRP. And these companies, I mean, they don't want to lose money. They're not in this business to lose money, especially over time with a company such as AMD, and especially with the success that they've seen with their Ryzen CPUs and margins going up on those. It's kind of a bit of a weird thing when they tell investors, well, we're making less margins on our graphics cards in 2025, even when we adjust for true input costs versus what we were in 2021. And we look at GDDR6 prices actually going up more than GDDR7 prices, and then we look at VRM costs as well as PCB costs going up. These are all looking at roughly, yes, a 10% increase in prices, which are heading in the direction of the RX 9070 XT and also the RX 9070. And there's no way to mask those costs, especially when my calculations for the margins are actually looking like they're kind of lower than a 9070 XT than they are on an RX 6700 XT. And so what also muddies the waters a lot more was when the RX 9070 and 9070 XT were initially released, there was also a lot of talks about these cards were really truly going to be a $649 for the 9070 XT and a $599 for the 9070. And that's where kind of looking at this information and digging deeper into it all, and then just relaying it to you guys, I do think that was where the card wanted to come. With kind of all their big talk that they did marketing-wise and taking pokes at Nvidia, they kind of had to release this card lower than expectations put it at. And to their credit, the RX 9070 and 9070 XT are some of the best cards that AMD have ever produced. So looking at the RX 9070 and 9070 XT in particular, these models, I do feel like they will go up in price roughly 10%. And I do feel like there's a lot of weight to this article. And so therefore, if you've been looking to buy one of these graphics cards in the next few months, it would be better to buy it sooner than later. But it's not going to be in the realm of, say, buying a DDR5 kit and initially paying $80 for that, or hoping to pay $80 for it and then seeing it for $200 plus. So the actual gravity of the price increases here for some of these graphics cards isn't going to be as big in relation to the DDR5 pricing. Though another thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is when it comes to buying a graphics card too, one powerful tool that we now have at our disposal is just simple search engine AI like Google's machine learning, as well as, for instance, I use personally Twitter is Grok. I think it does a really good job in giving you guys information that can help you make really good purchasing decisions. When I look at the graphics card that I want to buy, and even in my local currency in Australia, for instance, if I say, okay, what's the lowest price this particular graphics card has ever been? It'll analyze that very quickly for me. And so when I go out to buy a graphics card, I can then cross-reference these Black Friday sales, which a lot of them are bogus, as we know from experience. I can cross-reference those prices to historically what's the lowest price that said item has been available for, and then I can know if I'm getting a good deal. And so this is when I do a Black Friday video for you guys talking about deals, and over the weekend, I'll probably aim to do it over the weekend because there are some pretty good deals, but then there are some awful deals out there too. This will be a major element in looking for a graphics card and how to actually get the best deal. And so when I use, for instance, Twitter's Grok to analyze the prices of the RX 9070 XT and also the RTX 5072 graphics cards that we referenced in today's video, we actually see that they're some of the lowest prices they've ever been on Amazon. In fact, the RTX 5070 on Amazon has been roughly $20 cheaper than it is on Black Friday sales. So just, you can skip a lot of hype by just using this tool to your advantage and saying, okay, is this an actual good deal or not? And so that's one big trick I'll be using when I do a Black Friday sale video and telling you guys what deals that I'm personally getting. Is this component and this method of looking for deals is actually very powerful, and it cuts through a lot of BS and gives you an actual decent deal. Anyway, guys, with all that out of the way, the hype surrounding this go out and buy your graphics card right away because prices are just going to skyrocket, I do believe that's a bit of fluff. And yes, I do feel like some models will see a, say, 5 to 10% price increase, as we've pointed out with some of the AMD newer Radeon RX 9000 series GPUs. But then when we look at Nvidia, they've, I believe, increased their margins. And so they've got a bit more wiggle room to absorb price increases, if that makes any sense. Though another factor that I will talk about as a bonus factor before I get on out of here is forward inflationary pressures. Now, one thing you have to look out for is, of course, the stimmy checks. DJT posted with a social media post that he was going to be handing out stimmy checks. So if that happens, that's highly inflationary, very inflationary, as we've previously seen in the past with stimmy checks and what they do to tech prices especially. We already know that one. But when we look at, for now, the inflationary pressures that are coming forward, it's actually slightly in the decline of actually disinflation. I wouldn't say deflation, we're nowhere near that, but I'd say in the realm of disinflation, where newer levels of borrowing are slightly decreased, at least versus previous levels. So there's no imminent threat of crazy inflation coming, at least in the next month. And if there is, and if something drastically changes, I'll make an immediate update on that, because I never want you guys getting ripped off. That's one thing that I hate seeing, and I hate seeing this fluff around the industry where it's like, just go give into consumerism and go support these companies that have been raising their prices and essentially ripping you off more and more over the years. It's one thing that I don't like seeing is when that's like, just go out and buy it right now, unless there's some real weight to it. And this time around, it's kind of like some blurred lines, in my opinion. There is weight behind it, but it's not in the realm of DDR5 skyrocketing prices. Then lastly, I will say also, I do apologize for the amount of sponsored content that has been coming out in the last month, especially. There's just been a lot of good stuff that has been coming through with merit. And when that comes through and there's a win-win-win there, I do promote those products. But I do apologize for the sheer amount of sponsored content. It's unusual for me to get this many decent products come through and have a sponsorship tied to them. It's a very unusual month. So yeah, do apologize for the off tangent, especially like with vacuum cleaner and stuff like that. It's very weird, but trying the vacuum cleaner out is actually a really good vacuum cleaner. And then trying out something like Opera GX, I was blown away by how good that browser was too. So been some really cool stuff that has come through. and sponsor-wise, but again, it is outside the regular sort of enthusiast tech products. But thank you guys for supporting the channel and watching. And if you're enjoying the content, as always, be sure to hit that like button. Drop a comment down below. What do you think will happen with GPU prices in particular? Are you going out buying now, or are you just waiting? Or do you just simply not need a GPU at all? And in that case, you're fine. This market's not going to affect you at all. Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always. And with that aside, I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.